Hannah Brooks planted both boots on that platform and looked the rancher dead in the eye without flinching. She had ridden 3 days on a train that smelled like coal smoke and cattle, eaten nothing but salt crackers since Amarillo, and she was not in the mood for softness. She pulled a sealed letter from inside her coat and held it out at arm's length, the way a person hands over something they want no part of. "The woman you were expecting," she said, her voice flat and steady as West Texas hardpan. "She couldn't do it. Cried the whole way through Wyoming. Asked me to give you this." She pressed the envelope against his chest. "I'm sorry for your trouble, mister. I truly am. Before this story goes any further, I want to take just one moment to invite you to subscribe to this channel, ring that notification bell, and leave a comment telling me what city or state you're watching from. I love knowing how far these stories travel. Now settle in, because this one is going to take you somewhere you did not expect. The platform at Red Cedar Station, Montana, was crowded the morning of June the 9th, 1884, the way small-town platforms always are when something interesting is about to happen. Word had gotten around the way word always does in a town of 400 souls that Ethan Walker was coming to collect his mail-order bride. Folks had opinions about that. They had opinions about everything in Red Cedar, but they had especially strong opinions about Ethan Walker, because Ethan Walker owned the largest cattle operation in 3 counties and had spent the better part of the last year writing letters to a woman in St. Louis he had never laid eyes on. Some people thought it was romantic. Most of them were women. Some people thought it was desperate. Most of them were men who had never once written a letter to anybody and couldn't understand why a man with land and money and a decent face would go looking for a wife through the postal service. Ethan didn't care what any of them thought. He never had. He stood at the far end of the platform, wearing his good shirt, the dark blue one his mother had made the year before she died, and he was holding a bunch of wildflowers he had cut from the east meadow that morning before the dew dried. Yellow ones mostly, with a few purple ones tucked in at the edges, because he remembered Clara had written once that purple was her favorite color. He had read her letters so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. He knew she was 24 years old and had grown up in a boarding house and had never been further west than the Mississippi. He knew she was afraid of thunderstorms and loved peach preserves and had once nursed a 3-legged cat back to health for 8 months before it died anyway. He felt like he knew her. He had been looking forward to this day with a kind of quiet, private joy he hadn't let himself feel in a long time. The train groaned to a stop. Steam rolled across the platform in thick white clouds. Doors opened. Passengers began stepping down. A traveling salesman with 2 trunks, an elderly couple moving slowly and carefully, a young family with children running in 3 directions at once. Ethan watched every face. He was looking for a small, dark-haired woman in a blue traveling dress. Clara had described what she would be wearing in her last letter. Blue dress, white gloves, a hat with a yellow ribbon. He didn't see her. He waited. The platform crowd thinned. The conductor moved along the side of the train, checking something on his clipboard. The steam began to settle. And then a woman stepped off the rear car, and she was not Clara Whitfield from St. Louis. She was big. Not in the way people use that word to be cruel, though plenty of people on that platform were already using it that way in their heads. He could see it on their faces. She was tall and broad-shouldered and solidly built, the way a person gets from years of hard physical work, not from softness. She wore a faded brown work dress that had been washed so many times it had gone the color of creek mud, and boots that had seen serious mileage, and she carried a coiled lariat looped over one shoulder like it was as natural as a handbag. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical knot at the base of her neck. She had brown eyes that were calm and direct and missed nothing. She looked around this platform, once assessed the whole scene in about 4 seconds, the way someone does who has spent their life reading situations, fast found Ethan by his flowers and his expression, and walked straight toward him. People on the platform watched. A few of them whispered. A man in a brown suit said something quietly to the woman beside him, and they both smiled in the kind of way that wasn't kind at all. The woman with the lariat didn't look at any of them. She walked with the unhurried, ground-eating stride of someone who has crossed a lot of open country on foot and never once worried about being watched. She stopped in front of Ethan. She pulled the letter from inside her coat and held it out. "The woman you were expecting," she said. "She couldn't do it. Cried the whole way through Wyoming. Asked me to give you this." She pressed the envelope against his chest. "I'm sorry for your trouble, mister. I truly am." There was a silence on the platform. Not the comfortable kind. The held breath kind where everyone is waiting to see what happens next, because they've already decided it's going to be something worth watching. Ethan didn't move for a long moment. He looked down at the envelope in his hand. Then he looked back up at the woman standing in front of him, who was watching him. The way you watch a fire, you're not sure is going to spread. "How long did she cry?" he asked. The woman blinked. Whatever she had been expecting him to say, it wasn't that. "I'm sorry. Clara, you said she cried through Wyoming. That's a long stretch of track. Hours." He was looking at her steadily now, not with anger, but with something more complicated than that. "She must have been real frightened." "She was." The woman's voice was more careful now. "She talked about you some. She said you seemed like a decent man from your letters. She couldn't make herself get off that train." "Did she say why?" "She said the West was bigger than she remembered from pictures." Ethan was quiet for another moment. Then very slowly, he lowered the wildflowers to his side. And he smiled. It was not the smile of a man performing dignity for an audience. It was something quieter than that. Something that reached his eyes. He extended his right hand toward her steady and opened the way a man offers a hand to someone he means to treat with respect. "Then I'm grateful you came all this way to tell me the truth," he said. "That took something. What's your name, ma'am?" The woman looked at his hand for one full second, like she was verifying it was real. "Hannah," she said. "Hannah Brooks, out of Laredo, Texas." "Ethan Walker." He waited. She shook his hand. Her grip was firm and businesslike. "You heading somewhere from here, Miss Brooks, or were you just passing through?" "Passing through." She released his hand and took one step back, the small retreat of a person who has already decided this conversation is over. "I'll be on the northbound in the morning. Got business up toward Great Falls." "Cattle business." She looked at him sideways. "How'd you know that?" He nodded at the lariat on her shoulder. "That's not a decorative item." Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. "My father runs beef out of Laredo. I've been handling his drives since I was 16. "You break your own horses." "When they need breaking." "You do your own books." "Since my father's eyes got bad, yes." Ethan nodded slowly. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, like a man doing arithmetic in his head that he hasn't finished yet. "Miss Brooks," he said, and his voice was different now, lower, and something in the change made her go still. "I know you don't have any reason to do me any favors, and I know you've already gone well out of your way by delivering that letter. But I wonder if I might ask you one more thing before you go." "You can ask." "Would you consider staying 30 days? Hannah stared at him. "I beg your pardon. Not in any capacity other than professional," he said quickly, and the word professional was deliberate and careful. "I need help. Ranch help. Real ranch help, not somebody who knows which fork to use at supper. My foreman broke 3 ribs 2 weeks ago, and he's going to be laid up through the end of July. I've got a roundup coming a fence line that needs 40 miles of repair after the spring floods, and books that are 3 months behind." He paused. "I'd pay you $3 a day. That's cowhand wages, I'm not offering charity." Hannah Brooks had heard a lot of things in her 27 years. She had been talked past and around and through more times than she could count. She had been told her opinion wasn't needed, and her help wasn't wanted, and her presence was a problem. She had learned to read men fast, because you had to on a cattle drive, because the wrong read could get you hurt. She read Ethan Walker, standing on that platform, with his wilting wildflowers, and his dead fiancé's letter, and what she read was tired, honest, and genuinely plainly scared, though he was holding it together well. "Why 30 days?" she asked. He hesitated, just briefly. There's a legal matter, to do with my father's estate. It requires resolution by my birthday, which is the 30th of July. "What kind of legal matter?" He looked at her steadily. "The kind that requires a wife." The platform had emptied considerably. Most of the watchers had drifted away once it became clear there wasn't going to be a scene. A few remained, including the man in the brown suit, who was now openly staring with his arms crossed. "Let me understand what you're suggesting," Hannah said. "I'm not suggesting anything improper," Ethan said immediately. That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking if you would stay on this ranch as an employee, a working ranch hand, and allow me 30 days to figure out another solution to the legal problem, in exchange for fair wages and a private room in my house with a lock on the door." "A lock?" "Which I will not have a key to." Hannah looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked past him at the mountains rising in the distance beyond the tree line, blue and enormous and completely indifferent to anything happening on this platform. $3 a day, she said. $3 a day. And I leave the morning of the 31st. No arguments, no negotiations, no extensions. You have my word. Your word doesn't mean much to me yet, Mr. Walker. You're a stranger. That's fair, he said. It's also fair that you've got nowhere else to be until the northbound tomorrow morning, which gives you tonight to decide whether you trust me enough to ride out to the ranch and see it for yourself. Hannah looked at him for another long moment. She was running calculations. She could feel it, that internal arithmetic she had learned to trust, the thing her father called gut math. The thing that told you whether a deal was real or a trap. Tonight only, she said. I make no promises beyond that. Tonight only, he agreed. You can sleep in the bunkhouse with the door barred if you'd prefer. I'll introduce you to my cook, who is 63 years old and has opinions about everything, and will tell you immediately if I am not to be trusted. What's your cook's name? Pearl. Pearl Kinney. She's been with the Walker family for 30 years. Hannah picked up her travel bag from the platform boards where she'd set it down during the conversation. She settled the lariat back on her shoulder. I want to meet Pearl tonight, she said. And if Pearl says you're a liar, I'm gone before sunrise. That's more than reasonable, Ethan said. They walked off that platform side by side, and the man in the brown suit watched them go, with his mouth slightly open, and Hannah Brooks did not look at him once. She didn't need to. She had already decided he didn't matter. Pearl Kinney was everything Ethan Walker had promised, and several things he hadn't mentioned, including loudly opinionated, deeply suspicious of strangers, and possessed of a handshake that could crack walnuts. She took one long look at Hannah from the kitchen doorway, looked at Ethan, looked back at Hannah and said, You ain't Clara Whitfield. No, ma'am, Hannah said. I am not. Where's Clara Whitfield? On a train heading back east, best I can tell. Pearl looked at Ethan. The St. Louis girl ran. Clara decided the West wasn't for her, Ethan said carefully. Pearl was silent for 3 full seconds. Then she turned back to Hannah, folded her arms and said, You know anything about cattle? I've driven beef from Laredo to Kansas City twice and Laredo to Abilene 3 times. You know anything about keeping books? I kept my father's since I was 19. Can you ride a fence line in weather? I've ridden fence in ice storms, ma'am. Pearl looked at Ethan again, and the look she gave him was complicated in about 6 different ways. You're paying her proper, she said. $3 a day. 4, Pearl said. Ethan blinked. Pearl. $4 a day, Pearl said again flatly, in the voice of a woman who has never once in her life repeated herself as a question. She came off that train with a lariat and no complaints, and she told you the truth instead of running, which is more than your intended managed. $4 a day, and she eats at the main table, not with the hands. I'd prefer to eat with the hands, Hannah said. Pearl turned and looked at her with an expression that recalibrated slightly. Is that so? I don't know your hands yet, Hannah said. You don't sit at the head of a table you haven't earned. There was a pause. Pearl unfolded her arms. $4 a day, she said to Ethan, and she's staying in the east bedroom, not the bunkhouse, because that roof leaks and it's going to rain Thursday. She looked at Hannah. You want supper? Yes, ma'am, thank you. Wash up, troughs around back. She turned and walked back into the kitchen. Then she stopped without turning around and said, You're going to need work clothes. Clara Whitfield sent a trunk ahead. It's in the barn. Won't fit, but there's fabric in the sewing room, and I run a straight stitch. A pause. I ain't a charity. Neither am I, Hannah said. Pearl didn't respond. But when Hannah came in from washing up 20 minutes later, there was a plate on the table with twice the food on it as anyone else's. Hannah noticed. She didn't mention it. She sat down with the ranch hands at the long kitchen table and introduced herself as Hannah Brooks from Laredo and said she'd be helping out for 30 days. The men received this with the range of reactions men usually produce when a woman announces herself in a professional capacity. 2 of them were openly skeptical. 1 was politely neutral. 1 was too young to have formed a fixed opinion yet, and 1, a compact, dark-haired man named Luis Reyes, who turned out to be the most experienced hand on the property, simply nodded and said, "You know cattle, my whole life," Hannah said. "Good," Luis said. "We got a heifer stuck in the South Marsh. Been stuck 3 hours. 2 of us tried to pull her and she's not having it." Hannah looked at her supper plate. She looked at Luis. She picked up a dinner roll, put it in her coat pocket, stood up and said, "Show me." She had the heifer out of the marsh in 40 minutes. Luis held the lantern. The other 2 hands who had tried and failed to move the animal stood off to the side and watched. Hannah didn't say anything when it was done. She walked back to the house, washed her arms up to the elbow at the trough, went inside and finished her supper. When she looked up, Ethan was watching her from the doorway. "Foreman said nobody could move that animal tonight," he said. "Foreman wasn't there," Hannah said. She took a bite of her roll. Ethan leaned against the doorframe and looked at her with that same complicated arithmetic expression he'd worn on the platform. "You going to stay?" he asked. "I said I'd decide by morning." "It's 9:30. "Then I've got a few hours yet," she said. "Good night, Mr. Walker." She did stay. She decided sometime around 2 in the morning, lying on the bed in the east room, listening to the wind come off the mountains and the horses moving quietly in the far corral, that Pearl Kinney was not the kind of woman who kept faith with liars, and that the heifer was still alive because somebody had thought to try, and that $3 a day she was going to accept 4, because Pearl was right, and Hannah was not a charity, was fair wages for fair work, and that the mountains were extraordinary from this window, and she had never in her life seen mountains like these, and she was a practical woman, and practical women did not make decisions based on mountains. She made the decision based on the heifer. She told herself that for a long time afterward. By the end of the first week, Hannah Brooks had become a fact of Walker Ranch, the way certain facts establish themselves without asking permission, quietly, thoroughly, and in such a way that it becomes difficult to imagine the landscape without them. She was up before anyone else each morning, including Pearl, which Pearl noticed and did not comment on, but which resulted in an extra biscuit appearing on Hannah's plate at breakfast without explanation. She was out to the south pasture before Luis had finished his first coffee, and she rode the fence line the way someone rides who has been reading fence since before they were old enough to understand why fences matter. The men watched her. They watched the way men watch a person who is doing something better than they expected it to be done, which is different from the way men sometimes watch a woman, though a few of them were doing both. Hannah was aware of both and gave neither any particular encouragement. She had learned years back on the Texas drives that the fastest way to earn the respect of working cowboys was to outwork them without making a performance of it, not to prove anything, just to do the thing. She broke a horse on the 5th day that had thrown 2 men the week before. She didn't use a harsh bit or a long whip or any of the methods that some trainers used, and that Hannah had always privately considered evidence of a failure of imagination. She spent an hour just standing in the corral with the animal moving slow, letting it read her. The hands leaned on the fence and watched in silence, because something in her stillness commanded it. By the end of the hour, the horse was following her. By the end of 2 hours, she was on its back. It still shuddered and skidded and tried to argue, but it didn't throw her, and by the time she rode it out through the corral gate, it was arguing less. "What did you do?" The youngest hand. A boy named Danny, who was 17 and still amazed by most things, asked her when she brought the horse back in. "I listened to it," Hannah said. "Horses don't talk." "Everything talks," she said. "You just have to know what to listen for." She found the ranch books in a state that was somewhere between disaster and catastrophe. 3 months behind on entries. 2 accounts that appeared to have been double-charged. a payroll ledger with numbers that didn't track against the receipts, and a purchase record for lumber that had no corresponding delivery notation. She sat at Ethan's desk for 2 evenings with the ledgers spread out around her and a cup of Pearl's coffee going cold at her elbow, and worked back through it, entry by entry, finding the errors and the omissions and the places where good intentions had failed to connect with the actual mathematics. She brought Ethan her findings on the evening of the 7th day. He looked at the corrected ledger page. Then he looked at her. "This would have cost me $1,800, he said. "It nearly did," she said. "Your lumber supplier short-delivered by 30 posts and charged you for the full order. Happens a lot when ranchers don't have time to count on delivery day." "I didn't count. I know. You were short-handed and it was a flood week. I would have done the same." She closed the ledger. "You need to send a letter to Connolly's and attach the receipt. They'll credit the account. They won't want trouble." He was quiet for a moment. "Is there anything on this ranch," he said slowly, "that you can't do?" Hannah considered that genuinely, because she took questions seriously and didn't like to give careless answers. "I'm not much of a carpenter," she said. "I can drive a nail straight, but I can't do joinery. And I don't have the patience for embroidery." He looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his expression she didn't have a name for yet. "Thank you, Miss Brooks," he said, "for the books." "It's what you're paying me for," she said. She stood up and picked up her hat from the desk corner. "We've got 40 miles of fence that need work before the summer herd moves. I'd like to start at the northwest corner and work east." Luis agrees. "Whatever you and Luis think is right," Ethan said. "You know this land better after a week than some men know it after a year." She put her hat on and walked to the door. She stopped. She wasn't sure why she stopped. She had meant to keep walking. "Mr. Walker," she said without turning. "Yes." "Why did your father's will require you to be married by your birthday?" There was a pause. "He worried about me," Ethan said. "He thought I was the kind of man who would spend his whole life working and forget to build a life in the process." A pause. He wasn't wrong. Hannah stood in the doorway for another moment. The night was coming in through the open hall window, and it smelled like grass and coming rain, and the horses settling into their evening. "Seems like a hard way to make that point," she said. "My father was a hard man," Ethan said. "He loved that ranch more than anything on earth. He was afraid Victor would destroy it." "Victor," she said. "That's the cousin." "That's the cousin," Ethan confirmed. "He's in Billings right now talking to land speculators. He's been doing it since my father's funeral." Hannah turned around, just slightly, not quite facing him. "Does he know about me?" "About the arrangement." "He knows Clara didn't come. He'll know about you soon enough. This county doesn't keep secrets. And when he finds out, he'll file something with the county court," Ethan said. "He's been looking for a legal angle for months. Any arrangement that doesn't look like a genuine marriage will give him one." Hannah was quiet for a moment. She was doing that arithmetic again, the gut math. "Then you need to think carefully about what story you're telling Mr. Walker. Because right now, the story is his intended ran away, and he hired the first woman off the train. Victor's going to make noise with that." "I know. So, you need a better story." "Do you have one?" She turned fully then and looked at him in the lamplight and said, "I need to think about it. Give me a few days." "We have 23, he said. "I know," she said. "I'm aware of the calendar. Good night, Mr. Walker." She walked down the hall and out through the back of the house and stood in the yard for a long time with her face tilted up toward the Montana sky, which was doing something spectacular with clouds and stars that she absolutely was not making decisions based on. Victor Walker came to the ranch on the 10th day. He rode up to the front of the house in the middle of the afternoon on a gray horse that cost more than most men earned in a year, wearing a town suit and a hat that had never seen weather. He was 40 years old and handsome in the architectural way of men who know they are handsome and have organized their personalities around it. He had his father's eyes, the Walker family eyes, sharp and pale and assessing, and none of his father's substance. Hannah was coming back from the fence line with Luis when the gray horse appeared at the gate. She saw Victor's eyes find her across the yard and assess her the way a merchant assesses goods. He's not sure he wants to buy. That's Walker Ranch's prodigal cousin, Louise said quietly beside her. I figured, Hannah said. Victor looked at her. He looked at the dust on her coat and the lariat at her hip and the way she was walking, not apologetically, not sideways, just directly forward toward the barn where her horse needed water, and something moved through his expression that wasn't quite contempt, but was the next valley over from it. You must be the replacement, he called out. Hannah stopped. She turned and looked at him. She didn't say anything. Victor pulled his horse up a few feet closer. I heard about Clara. Pity. Ethan always did have trouble keeping things. He looked her over once more slowly, the way that is specifically designed to make a person feel reduced. I have to say this is quite a step down from what he was expecting. I can't speak to expectations, Hannah said. I don't know you well enough to have any. Something flickered in Victor's eyes. He hadn't expected the steadiness. You're here as ranch help, he said. It wasn't quite a question. I'm here as a ranch hand, Hannah agreed. Is there something you need from the ranch, Mr. Walker? Mr. Ethan Walker is in the north field if you need him. I'll wait, Victor said. The porch has chairs, Hannah said. She turned back toward the barn. You know, Victor said behind her voice, carrying the lazy ease of a man who is used to getting the last word. There are people in this county who are going to find your situation here very interesting. A woman unchaperoned, staying in a bachelor rancher's house. Hired help, arriving in place of a bride. He paused for effect. Some might call that scandalous. Hannah stopped. She stood very still. Then she turned around slowly and walked back toward Victor's horse, and she stopped just close enough that he had to look down at her, but not so close that she was looking up, and she said in the same flat, quiet voice she had used since she arrived. Some might. But some people in this county are going to find it interesting that a man who hasn't set foot on this ranch in 4 years is suddenly very concerned with what his cousin's hired help does with her evenings. She looked at him steadily. People in small counties notice all sorts of things, Mr. Walker. I find it's best to give them less to work with, not more. Victor looked at her. For the first time since he rode up, something in his face was not entirely composed. Get off your horse, Ethan's voice said. He had come around the corner of the barn, and he was covered in field dust, and he was not smiling. And he looked at Victor, the way you look at something you've been expecting and are not glad to see. Victor looked between them. He climbed down from the gray horse, and Hannah walked into the barn to take care of her animal, and she did not look back, and she did not need to, because she had already read the rest of that particular scene, and it did not require her presence to conclude. That night after supper, she heard Ethan and Victor through the parlor wall. Not the words, just the shape and temperature of the argument, which rose and fell and rose again before going abruptly silent. She lay in the east room, with her eyes open, and listened to the silence, and thought about the mathematics of 20 more days, and about the way Ethan had said Victor's name on the platform flat, and controlled like a man naming a weather system he's learned not to underestimate. She thought about a lot of things. She thought about what it had felt like to walk across that platform carrying somebody else's letter, which was not the first time in her life she had arrived somewhere as a substitute for someone more expected, someone smaller and softer and more suited to what the room had been arranged for. She thought about what it had felt like when Ethan Walker had looked at her and said, I'm grateful you came all this way to tell me the truth, and had extended his hand with the same steadiness and respect he might have offered any one man or woman, and how that one small gesture had done something to her equilibrium that she was still recalibrating around. She was not in the habit of being seen clearly. She was not sure how she felt about it now that it was happening. She closed her eyes. Outside, the Montana night settled over Walker Ranch, the way it did, enormous and dark and salted with stars, and 20 miles away. In Billings, Victor Walker was on his second whiskey and composing a letter to a county attorney, and the clock on everything was running. The morning. Victor Walker rode away from the ranch. Hannah was already 3 miles out on the fence line before the dust from his gray horse had settled. She didn't talk about what she'd heard through the parlor wall. She didn't ask Ethan what had been said. She picked up her tools and her wire, and she went back to work because the fence needed doing, and because she had learned a long time ago that the best response to a man like Victor Walker was not argument. It was evidence. It was 40 miles of repaired fence, It was a corrected ledger, and a heifer pulled from a marsh and a horse that nobody else could ride now walking quiet and steady through the north pasture. It was the kind of work that accumulated like interest, slow and steady, and impossible to argue with when it finally came due. Luis rode out to meet her at the halfway mark of the northwest line. He brought coffee in a tin canteen and didn't say anything for the first quarter mile. Luis was a man who understood the difference between silence that needed filling and silence that needed respecting, which was one of the reasons Hannah had decided she trusted him inside of the first 3 days. "Victor's filed something," he said finally. Hannah clipped a wire. "Already. Rode straight from here to the county clerk's office. Tom Hargrove told me this morning. Tom's brother works the desk." "What did he file?" "A formal challenge to the estate terms, claiming Ethan's not in compliance with the marriage requirement." Luis paused. He also told Tom's brother that Ethan was housing an unchaperoned woman of questionable character on the premises and calling it courtship. Hannah set down her wire cutters. She was quiet for a moment. Then she picked them back up. "How many hands know what my arrangement here actually is?" "All of us." "How many of them have talked to anyone in town?" Luis was silent for a fraction of a second too long. "Luis." "Danny told the girl at the feed store he thought it was real romantic," Luis said carefully. "He's 17. He didn't mean harm by it." Hannah exhaled slowly through her nose. "When did Danny get to be 17 and running his mouth at the feed store?" "He's always been 17. The feed store part is recent." She straightened up and looked out across the fence line and thought for a moment about the specific geometry of the problem, which was this. Victor now had a formal filing and a loose-tongued witness, and Ethan had 22 days and a hired hand who had made absolutely no promises beyond 30 days of fence work. "Tell Danny," she said, "that if he talks about this ranch's business at the feed store again, I'll put him on latrine detail for the rest of the month." "He won't like that." "No," Hannah said. "He won't." She went back to the fence. By the time she returned to the ranch that evening, Ethan had already heard from his lawyer in Billings. She knew it from the way he was standing in the yard when she rode in, not moving, not doing anything, just standing with his hat in his hand, and the particular stillness of a man who has received news that requires a moment of readjustment. She dismounted and led her horse toward the barn and waited. "Victor filed a formal challenge this morning," Ethan said. "I know, Luis told me. My lawyer says we have 10 days before the first hearing." He paused. "He also says that if I can't demonstrate a genuine and credible relationship by that hearing, the court is likely to require additional documentation. Testimony. Witnesses." "What kind of witnesses?" "People who know us. Know that this is real." He said the last word quietly, not quite meeting her eyes. Hannah tied her horse to the post. She turned around. "Mr. Walker, we both know what this is and what it isn't. I am not going to stand up in a court and swear to something false. I know that. I won't do it, not even for this ranch. I know that too." He finally looked at her directly, and his face was stripped of all its careful management for just a moment, just long enough for her to see the exhaustion underneath it. "I'm not asking you to lie, Miss Brooks. I'm asking you. I'm trying to figure out what the truth actually is. And I don't know yet. But I thought you should know the timeline." She looked at him for a long moment. 10 days, she said. 10 days. She took her horse into the barn, rubbed her down, checked her feet, watered her, gave her the last of the good hay, without measuring it the way she usually did. She stood in the barn for a while after, in the particular quiet of a barn at evening with the animals breathing and settling, and she thought about the mathematics of honesty, which is different from the mathematics of truth. Honesty is what you know. Truth is what is. Sometimes those are the same thing, and sometimes there is a gap between them, and she was standing in that gap right now, and she wasn't sure which direction to walk. She went inside for supper. Pearl put a plate in front of her without being asked which was the closest Pearl Kinney ever got to tenderness, and Hannah ate it without comment. Which was the closest Hannah Brooks ever got to saying thank you when she didn't have the words for it. The thing about Walker Ranch, that Hannah hadn't expected the thing she hadn't budgeted for in her original 30-day calculation, was how much it felt like somewhere she recognized. Not like somewhere she'd been before. Like somewhere she'd been trying to get to for a long time without knowing it had a name. It was in the mornings when the light came over the eastern ridge and hit the yard at that particular angle that made even the dust look like something worth keeping. It was in the way the horses moved in the west pasture, easy and unhurried because they had space enough and grass enough and nobody was pushing them. It was in the sound of Pearl's cast iron against the stovetop at 5 in the morning, and Luis's low voice giving instructions in a mix of English and Spanish that the hands had all learned to follow without thinking about it. It was in the fact that every person on this ranch worked hard and meant it, and went to bed tired and got up and did it again. Not because someone was watching, but because the work was the thing. Hannah had grown up on a ranch. She knew what a ranch felt like when it was run right. She knew what it felt like when it wasn't. Walker Ranch had been slipping. She could see the evidence of it everywhere. The 3 months of neglected books, the fence that hadn't been properly maintained, the horse that nobody had taken the time to reach. But underneath the recent neglect, the bones of the place were good and strong, and she could feel it. The way you feel the structure of a building even before you've seen the whole thing. Someone had built this place with intention. Someone had loved it. She found herself thinking about that more than was strictly professional. On the 12th day, she found the saddle blanket. She had been reorganizing the storage room at the back of the main barn, a task she had assigned herself because the room was a disaster of accumulated equipment and poor labeling, and at least 4 items she strongly suspected had been stored in the wrong place for so long they had simply been accepted as belonging there. And she had moved aside a stack of old feed sacks and a broken harness and 2 crates of tools that needed sorting. And behind all of it, hanging on a peg that was not visible from the doorway, was a saddle blanket. It was old, 8 or 9 years at least, maybe 10. The wool had been good quality, once deep brown, and it had been washed many times since, but it was the stitching that stopped her hand mid-reach. Sunflowers. A border of hand-stitched sunflowers along the top edge, done in yellow thread, that had faded but not disappeared. The stitching was careful and slightly uneven in places, the work of someone who was competent but not trained, someone who had learned from watching rather than instruction. The sunflowers were about 1 inch tall, each one slightly different from the last, because that's what happens when you stitch by hand without a pattern. You make something that is alive in a specific and irreproducible way. Hannah stood very still. She had a blanket like this. Had owned one for the first 23 years of her life until the night she didn't have it anymore. She was 19 years old when her mother made it. Her mother had been sick that winter, not badly, just the kind of tired that settles into people in their 50s, and she had spent the cold months doing handwork because her hands needed to be occupied and her body needed to rest. She had made Hannah the blanket out of wool she'd bought from a trader, and she'd stitched the sunflowers along the border because sunflowers were Hannah's. Because Hannah had always had a particular feeling about sunflowers, the way they turned their faces, always turning toward what was coming. Her mother died the following spring. The blanket was the last thing she made. Hannah had carried it on every drive after that, had slept under it on the trail, had packed it at the top of her bedroll because it was the one thing she was never going to leave behind. Until she left it behind. She had not thought about that night in a long time, because it was not a comfortable night to think about. The wildfire north of the Billings Road. The smoke so thick she had ridden directly into the edge of it before she understood what she was riding into, and by then the horse was panicking and the air was burning. She had managed to get clear barely, and she had been pushing south when she found the horse. Black gelding, a beautiful animal pinned under a fallen cottonwood that the fire had brought down. The horse was beyond help, and she had known it immediately, and she was already starting to push past because the fire was moving and she needed to be moving faster. And then she saw the man. How was under the horse. Not pinned, exactly. The horse had fallen across his legs, but not on them, wedged against a rock, and he was breathing, but he was unconscious, and she could see a cut on his head that had been bleeding long enough to dry partly on his cheek. Young. Not more than 25. Dark hair. Good jaw, the sunburned hands of someone who worked outdoors. She could not leave a breathing man in a wildfire. She had assessed the situation in about 30 seconds, decided on the only thing that was going to work, pulled the cottonwood from where it was bracing the horse with everything she had, which was considerable, and dragged the man free by his coat collar across 20 feet of scorched ground to where the air was better. She had wrapped her blanket around him because he was shaking with the kind of cold that comes from shock, even when the air is hot, and she had worked to get him clear-headed enough to move, which took 7 minutes that she counted carefully, because the fire was not being patient about any of this. He had been semi-conscious when they finally walked out of the smoke, her arm under his weight distributed against her side. She had gotten him to the road and flagged down a wagon heading south, and handed him off to the driver, who promised to get him to a doctor. She had never asked his name. She had never given hers. The wagon left the fire, moved east, and she rode south with no blanket and a very clear memory of a pair of Walker family eyes, sharp and pale, and assessing in a face that was too young to have such tired eyes. She had told herself she didn't need to know his name. She had told herself it didn't matter. She was standing in a barn in Montana, holding a saddle blanket with her mother's sunflowers on it, and her hands were not entirely steady. She folded it very carefully and put it under her arm and walked out of the storage room across the barn and across the yard to the main house, and she knocked on the door of Ethan's study. "Come in," he said. She opened the door. Howe was at his desk with papers spread out in front of him, reading something that had clearly frustrated him, because he had the particular set to his jaw that she had come to recognize over 12 days as his frustration face. He looked up. He saw the blanket. Everything about him went still, not the held-breath stillness of the platform, or the careful stillness of a man managing a difficult conversation. A different stillness. The kind that happens when the mind recognizes something before the body is ready to respond. "Where did you find that?" he said. "Storage room, back of the barn behind the harness rack." She set it on the desk in front of him carefully, like something that mattered. "I stitched those sunflowers, Mr. Walker. My mother taught me the pattern when I was 12. She made me this blanket the winter before she died, and I carried it for 4 years, until one night north of Billings, when I didn't have it anymore." She looked at him steadily. "I left it with an unconscious man in a wildfire because he was shaking, and he needed it more than I did. I always wondered what happened to him." Ethan looked at the blanket for a long, long moment. Then he stood up. He went to the wooden trunk in the corner of the room. She had noticed it before, a heavy old thing with brass fittings that didn't match the rest of the study's furniture, and he opened it. He moved aside several items she didn't look at closely and brought out something she recognized even before she could fully see it. A piece of the blanket. Not the whole of it. The part she remembered leaving had been in better condition than this, but the burn had taken the lower edge and part of the right side. The sunflower border was intact on 2 sides. The wool had a smell to it, still faint, the particular smell of old smoke and old time. He set it on the desk beside the one she had brought in. The 2 pieces of stitching were in the same hand. The same slight unevenness in the sunflower petals. The same way the thread turned at the corner of each bloom. "I woke up on the road," Ethan said. His voice was careful and low. "A wagon driver told me a big woman had pulled me out of the fire and sent him on his way before he could get her name. He said she had a dark braid and she wasn't afraid of anything." He paused. "I kept the blanket because it was the only thing I had left of her. I never knew if she was real." Hannah sat down in the chair across from his desk. Not because she planned to. Her knees just made that decision independently. "I thought about you," she said. And then, because that was more than she had meant to say, she said nothing else. Ethan sat down too. They looked at the 2 pieces of blanket on the desk between them, the burned portion and the intact one. The evidence of something that had happened 8 years ago in a wildfire north of the Billings Road, and had not stopped happening since, apparently. "You saved my life," Ethan said. "You had a good horse," Hannah said. "I was sorry about the horse." "So was I." A pause. "He was a good animal. His name was Franklin." "Franklin," Hannah said. "My father named him. He named all the horses after presidents. We had a Jefferson and a Monroe and a Harrison. Harrison died of colic the same year Franklin went, so that was a hard year for the founding fathers." Hannah looked at him, and she laughed. It came out unexpected, quick and real, And it surprised her, and it surprised him too. And for a moment, they were just two people on either side of a desk, with half a burnt blanket between them, laughing about a horse named after a president who had been dead for 30 years. Then the laughter stopped, and the silence that replaced it was different from all the previous silences. Fuller, like something had been poured into it. "What do we do with this?" Hannah asked. Ethan looked at the blanket pieces. "I don't know." "Neither do I." "But," he said slowly, "it does change what I know about you. What did you know before? That you were honest, that you were competent, that you were kinder than you wanted anyone to notice." He looked up. "Now I know that you are also the reason I'm alive to have this conversation." Hannah looked at him for a long moment. "That seems like an awful lot of weight to put on a 30-day work arrangement." "It does," he agreed. "What do you want to do about it?" She picked up her mother's blanket from this desk. She held it for a moment, feeling the weight of the wool, the particular texture of the stitching under her thumb. Then she folded it carefully and set it back down between them in the space between his portion and hers. "I want to finish the fence line," she said. "And then I want to think." "All right," Ethan said. She stood up. At the door, she stopped again. The doorway was becoming a place where she said things she hadn't planned. "Mr. Walker, what you said on the platform, about being grateful I told you the truth." She kept her hand on the doorframe. "Nobody had said anything like that to me before, in exactly that way." He didn't say anything. He waited because he had learned that she finished her thoughts in her own time. "I just thought you should know that," she said, "that it mattered." She walked down the hall and out through the kitchen door and across the yard in the dark, and she did not go to the east bedroom. She went to the corral fence and leaned on it and watched the horses for a long time, and the stars above. Of Walker Ranch were extraordinary, and she was absolutely not making any decisions based on that. Victor's retaliation arrived on the 14th day in the form of a social occasion which was Hannah would later think a more genuinely vicious weapon than a legal filing. Victor's wife, Cecilia Walker, held a summer gathering at the Walker townhouse in Red Cedar on a Saturday afternoon, and the invitation that appeared at Walker Ranch was addressed to Ethan Walker and guessed in Cecilia's looping hand, and the implication was clear and calculated. Come and be assessed, or stay away and be talked about. Ethan brought the invitation to Hannah at breakfast. She read it once. "She wants to look at me," Hannah said. "The whole county does," Ethan said. "Victor's been managing the story. If we don't show up, he keeps managing it. And if we show up, then they have to deal with the actual facts instead of the version Victor's been circulating." He paused. "You don't have to go. I can make excuses." "What kind of excuses?" "I can say you're not well." Hannah looked at him flatly. "I'm never not well," she said. "Give me 2 hours." Pearl spent one of those 2 hours in the sewing room. Hannah spent the other one at the water basin and the small looking-glass in the east bedroom, doing the best she could with what she had and refusing to feel bad about any of it. She was not a woman who owned many fine things. Her hair was her best feature and always had been thick and dark and long enough to do something with, and she put it up in the closest thing she could manage to what she'd seen ladies wearing in magazines, which was not perfect, but was not nothing either. She wore the best of her work dresses, the dark green one, which Pearl had quietly let out at the sides 2 days into Hannah's stay without being asked, and without mentioning it afterward. Ethan was waiting in the yard when she came out. He looked at her for a moment. Then he took off his hat. He did it without thinking about it. Just the automatic gesture of a man raised with manners, a hat tip that was genuinely meant not performed. And that small thing did something to the math in Hannah's chest that she spent the rest of the carriage ride to Red Cedar trying to account for. Cecilia Walker's gathering was exactly what Hannah expected, which was 30 people in their good clothes, in a house that was trying very hard to demonstrate the Walker family's refinement, and a hostess who greeted Ethan with warmth, and looked at Hannah with the particular bright-eyed assessment of a woman who has made her judgment before the conversation starts, and is now simply verifying it. "Miss Brooks," Cecilia said, her smile immaculate. "We've heard such interesting things." "I'm sure you have," Hannah said pleasantly. "It's a small county." She shook Cecilia's hand. Firm grip, no apology for it. The room watched. The room watched for the next 2 hours, with the dedicated attention of people who have been waiting for something interesting to happen. They watched Ethan Walker stand beside Hannah Brooks with an ease that looked uncalculated because it was. They watched Hannah talk to Ed Hoover from the bank about cattle prices with a command of the current market that made Ed forget he'd been skeptical of her. They watched her in conversation with Margaret Dunfield, who ran the county's largest dry goods operation, and who left that conversation with a recommendation for a better supplier and the particular energized look of someone who has just had a useful exchange they weren't expecting. Hannah ate with a good appetite and no apology. She laughed once genuinely at something old Dr. Kavanaugh said about a horse he'd tried to treat, and the laugh rang through the room and made everyone in earshot look toward it. Not because it was loud, but because it was completely real. Victor circled the room's edges and watched all of this with a face that was working very hard to remain composed. It was near the end of the afternoon, when the gathering was beginning its gradual dissolution, that Victor finally made his approach. He came up beside Hannah while Ethan was talking to the county clerk across the room, and he positioned himself at the angle that said, "This conversation is private," which is to say the angle that other people in the room could see, but not quite hear. "You're good at this," Victor said quietly. "I'll give you that." "At what?" Hannah asked. She was watching the room, not him. "Performing," he said. "That's what this is, isn't it? A performance. For the county. For the hearing." "I'm eating a biscuit and talking to people," Hannah said. "I don't think that qualifies as performance." "You arrived as a stranger. You're pretending to be a bride." Hannah looked at him then directly, and her expression was calm and not particularly interested. "I arrived as a ranch hand," she said. "I'm still a ranch hand. Everything else you're describing is a story you're telling Mr. Walker, and you should be careful with that. Stories have a way of ending differently than the person who started them intends." Victor looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes that was not as composed as the rest of him. "You can't win this," he said. "I'm not playing a game," Hannah said. "So there's nothing to win." She picked up her cup. "Enjoy the rest of your party." Ethan appeared at her elbow 6 seconds later. He had been watching from across the room. She knew it. She didn't know precisely when she had started being able to feel his attention, only that at some point in the last 2 weeks she had become aware of where he was in any given space without having to look. "You all right?" he said. "Perfectly fine," she said. "Victor's scared." "He's been scared since my father died," Ethan said. "No, he was ambitious before. He's scared now." She looked across the room to where Victor was reassembling his composure beside Cecilia. "There's a difference. Scared people make mistakes." Ethan looked at her. "How do you know that?" he asked. "Because I've been scared before," Hannah said. "And I made mistakes." She set down her cup. "We should go. You've been seen with me. People will talk, and they'll talk in a different direction than Victor wanted. That's enough for today." They drove back to Walker Ranch in the late afternoon, and the mountains caught the sun the way they only do in Montana in summer, red and gold at the edges. And Hannah sat beside Ethan on the carriage seat and looked at the mountains, and thought about Victor's scared eyes, and thought about the blanket on Ethan's desk, and thought about a horse named Franklin, and a fire 8 years ago, and a young man with tired eyes who had kept half a burnt blanket in a trunk as proof that something had been real. They were a mile from the ranch gate when Ethan said quietly, "You were remarkable today." Hannah looked straight ahead. "I was myself," she said. "That's the only thing I know how to be." "I know," he said. "That's what I meant." She didn't answer that, but her hands folded in her lap were not quite as still as she wanted them to be. Luis was waiting at the gate when they returned. He had a look on his face that Hannah had not seen before, which was the look of a man bearing information he would have preferred not to have. "Victor's attorney," Luis said, before they had fully stopped, "delivered a second filing to the county clerk this afternoon while you were in town. He's pulled in 2 witnesses from Red Cedar who are prepared to testify that your arrangement is fraudulent. A man named Dobbins from the hardware store and a woman, a Mrs. Foley." Ethan went very still. "Mrs. Foley," he said. You know her? Hannah asked. She's Cecilia's aunt, he said quietly. She was at the gathering today. Hannah thought back through the afternoon. She placed the name. A gray-haired woman near the window who had watched the room with sharp eyes and a closed expression and had not spoken to Hannah once. She was watching us, Hannah said. She was watching you, Louise said. Hannah thought about Victor's scared eyes. She thought about what she'd said in the carriage scared people make mistakes. She thought about the fact that 2 witnesses and a second filing in the same afternoon was not a mistake. It was an escalation. How many days to the hearing? She said. 8, Louise said. Hannah sat with that for a moment. 8 days. 8 days to the hearing, 16 days to Ethan's birthday, and a ranch full of work that still needed doing, and a court case that had just gotten harder. She climbed down from the carriage. All right, she said. Louise, I need you and Danny on the south fence at first light tomorrow. We're not losing schedule to this. She looked at Ethan. You need to talk to your lawyer tonight. I want to know exactly what these 2 witnesses have said and how much of it is true. Some of it's true, Ethan said. You are a ranch hand. We did meet on a platform. Clara did. What's not true is the fraudulent part, Hannah said. And what's not true is any implication that you have been anything other than a man of complete integrity in how you have treated me on this property. She held his gaze. Tell your lawyer that, and tell him I will testify to it under oath without hesitation. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Hannah, he said. It was the first time he had used her given name just like that without the miss. She noticed. Get your lawyer on the line, she said. We've got 8 days. She walked toward the barn to put her good dress away and change back into the clothes that meant business, and the evening settled over Walker Ranch and somewhere in Billings. Victor Walker was reading a second filing with the particular satisfaction of a man who believes he has won something, and the saddle blanket with the sunflower border sat on Ethan's desk in 2 pieces that had been waiting 8 years to be put back together. 8 days felt like 8 minutes. Hannah learned that about crisis early in her life. That time does not behave the same way when something is coming toward you as it does when nothing is. The days before the hearing moved with the particular compressed urgency of a storm that has already made up its mind, and the ranch moved with it because Hannah would not let it stop. She was up before 4 every morning. She had the south fence finished by the end of the 15th day, which Louise called impossible, and Danny called terrifying, and Hannah called Tuesday. She rode the perimeter of the north pasture on the 16th day and found 2 additional breaks in the line that the flooding had opened up and that nobody had flagged, fixed them both before noon, and was back at the ledgers by early afternoon because Ethan's lawyer had asked for a complete financial accounting to demonstrate the ranch's operational stability in court, and Hannah was not going to hand a Billings attorney incomplete work. Ethan watched all of this. He didn't say much about it. He was not a man who narrated things he was feeling, which Hannah had identified as both his best quality and his most inconvenient one. But she felt him watching. She felt the particular quality of his attention, the way you feel weather coming. Not a sound exactly, more a pressure, a change in the atmosphere that your body registers before your mind gets around to naming it. On the 16th evening after supper, after Pearl had gone to her room and the hands had gone to the bunkhouse, and the ranch had settled into its nighttime quiet, Ethan came and sat on the porch steps where Hannah was drinking her last cup of coffee and looking at the dark shape of the mountains against the sky. He sat down 2 steps below her. He didn't say anything for a while. Tell me about your father's ranch, he said finally. Hannah looked at the mountains. What do you want to know? What it was like, growing up on it. She was quiet for a moment. Not because she didn't want to answer, but because she was choosing which part of a large thing to hand over. It was the Brazos River country, she said. Flat in a way that Montana isn't flat. You could see weather coming from 50 miles out. My father used to say the horizon was God's telegraph. She wrapped both hands around her cup. He was a hard man, not mean, just shaped by hard things. He didn't have a lot of soft language. He showed you he loved you by teaching you how to survive. Is he still there on the ranch? He is. Getting older. His eyes are nearly gone now. My brother runs the day-to-day. A pause. My brother didn't want me on the drives after I turned 20, thought it wasn't appropriate. But you went anyway. My father wanted me there. My father understood what I was capable of. She took a sip of her coffee. My brother is not a bad man. He just has a picture of what a woman is supposed to be doing, and I don't fit in the frame. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Is that why you were on that train heading north? Partly. She considered how much to give him and gave him more than she planned to. My brother got married in April. His wife is a perfectly good woman. She took one look at me and decided I was a problem to be solved. She said it without bitterness, just the flat fact of it. I've been solving myself out of situations my whole life. It seemed like a good time to do it geographically. Great Falls, he said. A woman I knew from a drive 3 years ago has a spread up there. She offered me a position in February. I just hadn't gotten around to taking it yet. She paused. Then the train stopped at Red Cedar, and a man handed me wildflowers and said he was grateful I told him the truth. Ethan didn't say anything. You should know, Hannah said carefully, that I am not. I don't make decisions based on sentiment. I make them based on what is real and what is right. And I want to be honest with you about the fact that I don't know right now exactly what is real and what is right, and that is not a comfortable place for me to be. I know, he said. Do you? He turned and looked up at her from the lower step. I spent a year writing letters to a woman I never met because I thought that was the safe version of looking for someone. I thought I could know a person through what they chose to write, and I could manage the rest. He looked away. Then you walked across a platform and told me the truth in the first 30 seconds, and everything I thought I understood about what I was looking for stopped making sense. Hannah set her cup down on the step beside her. Ethan, she said. It was the first time she had used his given name just like that, the way he had used hers. He looked up. Let's get through the hearing first, she said. All right, he said. But neither of them moved for a long time after that. Sitting on the porch steps of Walker Ranch in the dark, with the mountains standing enormous and patient behind the tree line, as if they had been waiting for this particular conversation for 8 years and were prepared to wait a little longer. The hearing was set for a Thursday. Ethan's lawyer was a methodical man named Carver, gray-haired and precise, who had handled Walker family business for 11 years, and who looked at Hannah across the office table on Wednesday morning with an expression that was professionally neutral and personally uncertain. You understand, Carver said, that Victor's witnesses will attempt to characterize this arrangement as transactional and fraudulent. That you are not genuinely a romantic partner, but a hired hand brought in to satisfy the estate terms. I understand, Hannah said. And you can speak to the genuine nature of your relationship with Mr. Walker. Hannah looked at Carver steadily. I can speak to the truth of my experience on this ranch and in Mr. Walker's company. If the truth is sufficient, then yes, I can speak to it. Carver looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at Hannah. It will be sufficient, Ethan said. Carver did not look entirely convinced. But he was a lawyer and not a preacher, and his job was to build the strongest available case, not to decide what was in people's hearts. He spent the rest of the morning going through the financial documentation Hannah had prepared, which was thorough enough that he stopped twice to confirm she had done it herself. All of it, Hannah said. You have an accounting background. I have a practical background, Hannah said. Same result. They left Carver's office at noon. Standing on the street outside with the town moving around them in its ordinary Thursday-1 fashion. Ethan said, Are you afraid? Hannah considered that honestly. No. Are you? Yes, he said without hesitation. She looked at him. Good. He looked back at her. Good. It means you understand what this costs, she said. Men who aren't afraid of the right things make the worst decisions. She put her hat on. I'll see you back at the ranch. She rode back alone. She needed the solitude and the motion, the rhythm of the horse under her, and the road unrolling ahead to run through everything one more time. The witnesses. Dobbins from the hardware store, who had apparently told Victor that he'd overheard Danny talking at the feed store. Mrs. Foley, Cecilia's sharp-eyed aunt, who had stood at the gathering and watched Hannah eat and laugh and talk to Ed Hoover about cattle prices, and who had apparently concluded that a woman who could do all of those things simultaneously was performing rather than simply being herself. Hannah had been performing, she supposed, in the sense that she had been aware of being watched and had not stopped being aware of it. But there was a difference between performing and pretending, and she had not pretended anything. She had been herself loudly and without apology in a room full of people who expected something smaller. If that looked like a performance to Mrs. Foley, that was Mrs. Foley's limitation, not Hannah's. She was 3 miles from the ranch gate when she heard the sound. She pulled up her horse. Sound carries strangely on open land. She had learned that on the Texas drives that you could hear things from remarkable distances if the wind was right, and that the particular quality of a sound told you things that distance alone didn't. What she heard now was not the ordinary sound of ranch work. It was the sound of raised voices, multiple people, and one voice higher than the others, Pearl's voice. Hannah pressed her heels in and rode. She came through the ranch gate at a pace that brought Luis out of the barn at a run, and she was off her horse and moving toward the sound before he reached her. "What is it?" she said. "Victor came," Luis said, matching her stride. "Brought 2 men with him. They're in the yard with Pearl." "Where's Ethan?" "Northfield. I sent Danny to get him." Hannah rounded the corner of the house. Victor was standing in the middle of the yard with a county deputy on his left and a man she didn't recognize on his right, and Pearl Kinney was standing on the front steps with her arms folded and a cast-iron skillet in her right hand, not raised but not lowered, either position of a woman who hasn't decided yet. "Do not have the authority to enter this house without," Pearl was saying. "Ma'am, I'm not asking to enter the house," the deputy said with the resigned patience of a man who has been arguing with Pearl Kinney for longer than he wanted to. "I'm asking you to confirm." "I don't confirm anything for men who show up unannounced with Victor Walker," Pearl said. Victor saw Hannah. His expression adjusted. Not quite surprised because he had been expecting her eventually, but something in the adjustment told her that he had timed this visit to the gap between her departure to Carver's office and the time he calculated she would return, and she was back earlier than he'd expected. "Miss Brooks," he said, "we were just discussing the upcoming hearing." "On private property," Hannah said, "without the property owner present." "The property owner is unavailable. He'll be here in 10 minutes. She walked across the yard until she was between Victor and the porch steps, which put her between Victor and Pearl, which was where she intended to be. "You can wait or you can go." "I'm here in an official capacity," Victor said, and he looked at the deputy when he said it. The deputy cleared his throat. "Mr. Walker has a court order requesting documentation of certain property records prior to tomorrow's hearing, specifically the livestock inventory, and those records are with Mr. Walker's attorney," Hannah said. "As the court has been informed, any documentation requests go through Carver's office." She looked at the deputy directly. "I think you know that." The deputy had the look of a man who did in fact know that, and who had been hoping nobody would say it out loud. "Yes, ma'am," he said with a brevity that suggested he was going to be having a conversation with Victor Walker about appropriate procedures at the earliest opportunity. Victor looked at Hannah. "You have good instincts," he said quietly, pitched below the deputy's hearing. "I have experience," Hannah said, equally quiet. "With men who use official channels to do unofficial things, you learn to recognize the pattern. And yet," he said, "tomorrow you're going to sit in that courtroom and tell a judge that what's happening on this ranch is something real, something genuine." He let that sit for a moment. "Is it Miss Brooks genuinely, because I've been watching you for 2 weeks, and what I see is a capable woman doing a job that happens to come with a deadline?" Hannah looked at him. She thought about the porch steps in the dark. She thought about a man sitting 2 steps below her saying, "I stopped knowing what I was looking for." She thought about a burnt blanket in a trunk and 8 years of not knowing if something was real. "You should leave now," she said. "The documentation is with Carver. The deputy knows the procedure. You've done what you came to do, which was not about documentation." She looked at him evenly. "See you in court tomorrow, Mr. Walker." Victor held her gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he tipped his hat in the particular way of a man who is performing courtesy because he doesn't have a better option, and he turned and walked to his horse, and the deputy followed with the slightly faster pace of a man who has remembered somewhere else he needs to be, and the third man who had not spoken once followed them both. Pearl came down the steps and stood beside Hannah, and they watched the 3 horses go through the gate. "Good," Pearl said. "What did he say before I got here?" Hannah asked. "He told me you were a fraud, and that honest women didn't ride fence lines in men's clothes." Pearl looked at the skillet in her hand, considered it, and lowered it to her side. "I told him that honest women did whatever work needed doing, and that his opinion of my clothes was something I would file in the trash pile." Hannah looked at her. "I like you, Pearl," she said. I know, Pearl said. "Come inside. I made pie." Ethan arrived back from the Northfield 12 minutes later, still moving at the speed of a man who had received urgent news, and found Hannah and Pearl sitting at the kitchen table with pie and coffee, which was either a very good sign or a sign that something had been resolved by the time he got there, and he needed to catch up. Hannah told him what had happened. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she had come to appreciate about him, that he listened the way people listen when they actually intend to hear you. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "He's trying to rattle you before tomorrow," he said. "I know. Is it working?" She looked at him. "What do you think?" He looked at her, and something in his face settled like a knot releasing. "No," he said. "No, I don't think it is. Eat some pie," Pearl said to him in the voice she used when she'd decided a conversation was complete. He sat down and ate some pie. The courtroom in Red Cedar was small, in the way that county courtrooms in 1884 were small functional wood-paneled, built for utility rather than grandeur, with a gallery of benches behind the bar rail that were by 8 in the morning of the hearing already occupied by a significant portion of the county's interested population. Because that was the thing about a small county, when something interesting was scheduled to happen at 9 o'clock on a Thursday, people adjusted their schedules. Hannah walked in beside Ethan and did not look at the gallery. She sat where Carver directed at the table on the left, and she straightened her dress. The dark green one, Pearl, altered the best she had, and she folded her hands in her lap and looked at the judge's bench and waited. Victor was at the table on the right with his attorney, a younger man named Priest, who had the particular energy of someone who had prepared extensively and was very confident about it. Victor was in his town suit. He looked across at Hannah once briefly, and she looked back at him with the same expression she used for ledger errors, identifying, categorizing, moving on. Judge Howard Crane was 61 years old and had been sitting on this bench for 19 years and had the durable skepticism of a man who has heard most stories and remained permanently unconvinced by the ones that rely too heavily on their own elegance. He read the filings in front of him without expression, looked up, looked at both tables and said, "Let's proceed." Victor's attorney went first. "How was good?" Hannah granted him that privately. He laid out the timeline cleanly. Clara Whitfield's failure to appear. Hannah's arrival in Clara's place, the 30-day arrangement, the lack of any prior relationship between Walker and Brooks, and he framed all of it with the particular precision of a man who knows that truth is not the enemy. Context is. Everything he said was technically accurate. What he was constructing from accurate pieces was a structure that bore very little resemblance to what had actually happened. Dobbins from the hardware store testified that he had overheard a ranch hand describe the arrangement as a business deal to keep the ranch from going to Victor. He was nervous on the stand and repeated himself twice and kept looking at Victor when he answered, which was a tell that Judge Crane noticed, because Judge Crane noticed everything. Mrs. Foley was more composed. She described the gathering at Cecilia's house in careful detail, Hannah's behavior, Ethan's attention, the overall impression of two people managing an appearance rather than being themselves. She was a precise woman, and she believed what she was saying, and that was what made her more dangerous than Dobbins. She wasn't lying. She was wrong, but she wasn't lying. When she stepped down, Priest looked at the judge with the quiet satisfaction of a man presenting a completed argument. Then Carver said, "Your Honor, Mr. Walker would like to address the court directly." Priest was on his feet. "Your Honor, the counsel for the respondent has the right to—" "I know my procedure, Mr. Priest," Judge Crane said and looked at Ethan. Mr. Walker. Ethan stood. I didn't have notes. He had told Carver the night before that he wasn't going to use notes, and Carver had not been pleased about it, and Ethan had listened to Carver's concerns with complete respect and then not changed his mind. He stood in front of Judge Crane and the crowded gallery and Victor's carefully composed face, and he told the truth. Not the estate, not the deadline, not the legal architecture of his father's will. He started with a wildfire north of the Billings Road 8 years ago, and a horse pinned under a cottonwood and smoke so thick the sun went brown. He talked about waking up on a road with a wagon driver telling him a woman had carried him out of the fire and disappeared before he got her name. He talked about keeping half a blanket in a trunk for 8 years, because it was proof that someone had chosen to save his life without knowing him, without asking for anything, without waiting to be thanked. He talked about standing on a platform with wilting wildflowers, and a letter from a woman who had changed her mind, and a stranger walking toward him with a lariat, and the most direct eyes he had ever seen in his life, and the exact words she said, and the fact that his first response to those words was not anger, but gratitude. He talked about a heifer in a South Marsh, a horse nobody else could reach, 40 miles of fence in weather, books corrected without being asked, a woman who ate with the hands because you don't sit at the head of a table you haven't earned. A woman who had told him on a porch in the dark that she didn't make decisions based on sentiment, and who he knew. With the certainty of a man who has been paying very close attention, was sitting in this courtroom right now, making one of the most significant decisions of her life. The courtroom was completely silent. Judge Crane was looking at Ethan with an expression that had shifted from durable skepticism to something more complicated. "Your Honor," Ethan said, and his voice was steady and quiet and entirely without performance. "I cannot tell you what the future holds. I can tell you that every day of the last 17 days has been the most honest and necessary and real experience I have had in a very long time. And I can tell you that whatever this court decides today, I am not here to protect an inheritance. I am here because the woman sitting at that table came off a train and handed me a letter and told me the truth, and I would rather lose this ranch than stand in front of you and pretend that what happened on this property over the last 3 weeks was anything other than what it was." He paused. "Which is the beginning of something I don't have a finished word for yet." He sat down. The silence in the courtroom lasted 4 full seconds. Then Judge Crane looked at Hannah. "Miss Brooks," he said, "the court would hear from you." Hannah stood. She had not prepared a speech. She was not a speech person. She was a person who said the thing that was true and stopped when the true thing was finished. She stood in front of Judge Crane and the gallery and Victor's table, and she said, "I came to Red Cedar to deliver a letter. I had a northbound train to catch the next morning, and no intention of missing it." She paused. "I missed it." She looked at the judge steadily. "I'm going to tell you something I haven't said out loud before. Not to Mr. Walker, not to Pearl Kinney, not to anyone on that ranch." She took a breath. "I never stayed because of the ranch. I knew within the first 3 days that I could fix the books and the fence and the horse and the marsh, and I knew that wasn't why I was staying. I stayed because every morning on Walker Ranch felt like the first morning of something I hadn't known I was waiting for. And every evening on that porch felt like coming home to a place I'd never been." She stopped. Then she said simply, "And every day he became more the man I wanted beside me." The courtroom did not make a sound. Victor's attorney had his pen in his hand. He was not writing. Victor was looking at his table. Judge Crane sat back in his chair and looked at both of them for a long moment, with the eyes of a man who has been deciding the truth of things for 19 years and knows it when he hears it. He looked at Victor's table. "Mr. Priest," he said, "your witnesses have testified to the circumstances of this arrangement. I do not dispute the accuracy of their timeline. What I dispute is the conclusion drawn from it." He picked up his pen and made a notation. "Two people who met under unusual circumstances and who have developed a genuine attachment in the time since is not fraud. It is in my 19 years on this bench closer to the most honest account of how attachments form than most of what I hear in this room." He set his pen down. "The challenge is dismissed." The gallery exhaled. Victor went very still. "Furthermore," Judge Crane said, and his voice had the particular weight of a man adding something he has decided carefully. "I would note for the record that the bringing of this challenge, the timing, the witnesses, the documentation requests made through unofficial channels on private property, constitutes conduct that this court will be monitoring with considerable attention going forward." He looked directly at Victor for the first time. "Is that understood, Mr. Walker?" Victor's jaw tightened. "Yes, Your Honor." "Good." Crane looked at Ethan. "Congratulations, son. Now don't waste it." He stood. Everyone stood. And then the room broke open into the sound of 30 people deciding what they thought about what they had just witnessed, which was, depending on who you asked, the most romantic thing that had happened in Red Cedar County in a decade, a clear win for honest dealing over inheritance maneuvering, or definitive proof that Judge Crane was getting more sentimental in his old age. Pearl was in the gallery. Hannah had not known she was there until she stood and found her 3 rows back with her arms folded and her face in the precise configuration of a woman who has been proven right about something she never had any doubt about. Hannah looked at her. Pearl unfolded her arms and gave a single firm nod. That was all. But it was Pearl, and it was everything. Outside on the courthouse steps, the county arranged itself around them in the way that counties arrange themselves when something has shifted. People coming to congratulate Ethan, to introduce themselves to Hannah, with the recalibrated warmth of people who have just watched someone be seen clearly and are adjusting their initial assessment accordingly. Hannah shook hands and said thank you, and meant it, and did not feel entirely like herself, which was not necessarily a bad thing. She felt like a person in the process of becoming someone slightly larger than she had been when she walked in. And that was uncomfortable, the way all growing is uncomfortable. And she was going to have to think about it later when there weren't 30 people and a Montana summer day around her. Victor came out of the courthouse after most people had gone. He looked at Ethan. He did not look at Hannah. "This isn't over," he said quietly to Ethan. Ethan looked at his cousin for a long moment. Not with anger, not with triumph. With the particular quality of a man looking at something he has understood for a long time and is tired of having to manage. "Victor," he said, "you've been fighting this ranch since the day my father died. You're going to lose." He said it without cruelty, just the flat delivery of a final fact. "Go home." Victor looked at Hannah, then just briefly, and what was in his face was something she hadn't expected. Not anger, not calculation, but something closer to a man recognizing that he has misjudged something significant and doesn't know yet what to do with that recognition. Then he walked to his horse and rode toward Billings, and the dust settled behind him, and Hannah stood on the courthouse steps and looked at the mountains, and they were the same mountains. They had always been enormous and blue and indifferent, and somehow today, that felt less like indifference and more like permanence. Ethan came and stood beside her. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything either. They stood on the courthouse steps in the summer of 1884, with 13 days left on a 30-day arrangement that neither of them was thinking about in those terms anymore, and the whole county moved around them, and the mountains held still, and the thing that had been beginning since a platform and a letter and a pair of wildflowers continued its patient, unhurried, inevitable work. "We should get back," Hannah said finally. "Luis is short-handed on the north fence. We should," Ethan agreed. Neither of them moved immediately. Then Hannah said in a voice that was very quiet and very even, "That thing you don't have a finished word for yet." He looked at her. "I think I might be starting to," she said. She walked down the steps to where their horses were tied, and she did not look back, and she did not need to, because she could feel him standing there in the particular way she had learned to feel his presence. Like weather, like pressure, like something the atmosphere does before the thing you've been waiting for finally arrives. They rode back to Walker Ranch, in the kind of silence that has weight to it, the kind that isn't empty, but full pressed tight, with everything that had been said in that courtroom, and everything that hadn't been said on the courthouse steps. The horses moved at an easy pace, and the road unrolled, and neither of them spoke for the first 2 miles, and it was not uncomfortable. That was the thing Hannah noticed most. The silence between them had stopped being uncomfortable somewhere in the last 17 days, and she hadn't marked the exact moment it happened, only that it had. Luis was waiting at the gate again. He had developed. Hannah had noticed a habit of being at the gate when things were coming to a head, as though he had some internal barometer for the ranch's pressure and positioned himself accordingly. He looked at their faces when they rode in and read what was there, and something in his shoulders released. "Well," he said. "Dismissed," Ethan said. Luis closed his eyes for 1 second. Then he opened them and said, "Danny owes me $2. "You bet on the hearing," Hannah said. "Danny bet against. I told him he was an idiot." Luis took Ethan's horse. "Pearl made a cake." "Pearl said she wasn't making a cake," Ethan said. "Pearl said a lot of things," Luis said. "Pearl made a cake." Inside, Pearl was standing at the kitchen counter with the specific posture of a woman who has done something she intends to present as ordinary. The cake was on the table. It was a real cake, 3 layers, with the kind of effort that takes most of an afternoon, and Pearl had put wildflowers on the plate around it, yellow ones, which was either a coincidence or Pearl being Pearl, and Hannah suspected it was Pearl being Pearl. "Sit down," Pearl said without turning around. "Both of you." They sat. Pearl cut the cake. She put the first piece in front of Hannah. She put the second piece in front of Ethan. She cut a third piece for herself, which she had never done at the main table before in Hannah's presence, and she sat down at the end of the bench and picked up her fork. "Good," she said, and then she ate her cake, and that was the entirety of Pearl Kinney's victory speech. Danny came in from the bunkhouse at some point and hovered in the doorway until Pearl pointed at a chair without looking up, and he sat down and got a piece of cake too, and Luis came in and did the same. And for a while, Walker Ranch sat around a kitchen table, eating cake in the particular way of people who have been through something together and are letting themselves feel the other side of it. Hannah ate her cake and looked at the people around the table and felt something move through her chest that she didn't immediately have a word for. It was not happiness exactly, though it was in the neighborhood. It was more like recognition. The feeling of a thing arriving that you have been waiting for long enough that you'd stopped actively waiting and just carried the waiting around with you, the way you carry something that's been in your pocket so long, you forget it's there. She looked up and found Ethan looking at her from across the table. She looked back down at her cake. She was going to need to think about all of this very carefully. The trouble with thinking carefully was that the next 3 days did not leave much room for it. The north fence needed 2 more full days of work. The cattle needed moving to summer pasture, which required 4 days coordination that couldn't slip because the grass wouldn't wait for human emotional complications. The ranch books needed a final reconciliation pass before Carver filed the last documentation with the estate. Hannah threw herself into all of it with the same thoroughness she brought to everything. And if part of the reason was that staying in motion kept her from having to sit still with the thing she was feeling, she did not examine that part too closely. On the 20th day, a letter arrived from Great Falls. Hannah found it on the kitchen table when she came in from the pasture. It was addressed in the handwriting of her friend, May Sutherland, and it said, among other things, that the position was still available, that May's operation was expanding, and that if Hannah arrived before the 1st of August, there would be a foreman's salary in it, rather than a hand's wage. It was a good letter. It was a generous offer from a woman Hannah respected. She read it twice, standing at the kitchen table with trail dust still on her coat, and then she set it down and went to wash up and thought about it the way you think about something you're not ready to think about yet. Ethan found it on this table an hour later. She was in the study reconciling the ledgers when she heard him come in through the front door and stop in the kitchen. The silence that followed the stopping had a particular quality. She kept her pen moving. His footsteps came down the hall and stopped at the open study door. "May Sutherland," he said. "She's a good rancher. I've known her since the Abilene drive." Hannah did not look up from the ledger. "She's offering foreman wages." Ethan was quiet for a moment. She heard him come into the room. He sat down in the chair across from the desk, the one she usually sat in when she brought him the books, and he was quiet long enough that she finally looked up. His face was doing several things at once, none of which he was trying to hide, which was unusual. Ethan Walker was a man who had spent a significant portion of his life managing his face. 10 days, he said. 10 days, she agreed. "And you haven't decided?" It was not a question. She considered him for a moment. "No," she said. I haven't. What do you need in order to decide? She set her pen down. That's the thing, Ethan. I don't think this is something I can decide by collecting more information. She looked at him steadily. This is the kind of decision you make because you know what you know, and I know what I know. I just have to... She stopped. I have to figure out whether what I know is enough. What do you know? He asked quietly. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I know that I have spent my entire adult life being competent in places that didn't want me. And I know that this ranch wanted me before you did, which sounds strange, but it's true. The fence wanted me. The books wanted me. That heifer in the marsh wanted me. A pause. And somewhere around the 8th day, I knew you did too, and that scared me in a way the fence and the books and the heifer didn't. Why? He said. Because I can fix a fence, she said. And I can't fix what happens if I'm wrong about a person. He looked at her for a long time. The lamp between them was burning low, and the study was full of the evening quiet of a house that has been worked hard all day and is settling into rest, and the 2 pieces of saddle blanket were still on the corner of the desk where they'd been since the night she found them. You're not wrong, he said. She looked at him. About me, he said. You're not wrong. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she picked up her pen. I know, she said. I told you. I know what I know. She opened the ledger. Let me finish the books. He stood up. At the door he stopped. Turnabout, she thought, almost amused. They were always stopping at each other's doors. Hannah, he said. Ethan. Don't answer May Sutherland's letter yet. She looked at her ledger. I wasn't planning to, she said. She heard him exhale. Just slightly. The exhale of a man who has been holding something and has just been given permission to put it down temporarily. He went to bed. She finished the books. Victor's next move came on the 22nd day, and it came from a direction none of them had anticipated, which was the specific signature of Victor Walker, operating at the edge of desperation. Not the county court this time. A territorial attorney brought in from Helena, filing a challenge not to Ethan's compliance with the estate terms, but to the estate terms themselves, arguing that the marriage clause in the original will was legally unenforceable under territorial property law, and that the entire estate should therefore revert to equal partition between Ethan and Victor. Carver sent a rider out to the ranch at 7 in the morning. Hannah read the filing summary over Ethan's shoulder at the breakfast table. Pearl hovered near the stove with the particular stillness of a woman who is not going to be useful in a legal argument, but intends to remain present for moral reasons. He's not trying to prove fraud anymore, Hannah said. No, Ethan said. He's trying to undo the whole thing, the will itself. If the marriage clause is unenforceable, then whether I'm married or not becomes irrelevant. He gets half the ranch regardless. Half, Hannah said. Half, Ethan confirmed. And then he sells his half to the land speculators, and a cattle operation can't function split that way. The whole thing falls apart. He set the paper down. He's been saving this. Hannah looked at him. He filed in Helena. That's a territorial court. Yes. How long does a territorial filing take? Carver thinks 2 to 3 weeks for an initial response, possibly longer. Your birthday is in 8 days, Hannah said. Yes. She sat back and thought about it. The geometry of the problem had changed shape. Before it had been about proving the legitimacy of their arrangement to a county judge who was already inclined to evaluate evidence over argument. This was different. This was a legal challenge to the foundational document of the Walker estate, filed in a court that was 50 miles away and operated on a completely different timeline. Victor doesn't need to win the territorial filing, she said. Ethan looked at her. He just needs it to create uncertainty, she said. If there's a pending territorial challenge to the will, any marriage Ethan enters into before his birthday becomes potentially moot. The estate lawyers will advise him not to act on the will's terms until the challenge is resolved, which means the deadline becomes meaningless, which means he waits, Ethan said. And the longer he waits, the more the ranch is in limbo. He put both hands flat on the table. He's not trying to win quickly. He's trying to make winning slowly more expensive than giving up. Danny, who had been listening from the far end of the table with his coffee and his 17-year-old face, said, "That's real dirty." "It is," Luis said. Pearl set a fresh pot of coffee on the table, without saying anything, which was Pearl's version of a declaration of war. Hannah looked at the filing summary again. She looked at the date stamps. She looked at the name of the territorial attorney. Victor had retained a man named Aldous Fitch, and she felt something move in her memory, the particular movement of a name that is connected to something she knows. "Aldous Fitch," she said. "You know him," Ethan said. "I know of him." She set the paper down. "He handled a land dispute in Parker County, Texas 4 years ago. Railroad company trying to claim right-of-way through a family's cattle property. The family won." She paused. The reason they won was that Fitch had filed a clause in the original challenge that was contradicted by the territorial survey records, and once that was established, the rest of his argument collapsed. She looked at Ethan. "Fitch is good at the first filing. He sets up his argument fast and it looks solid, but his documentation is always thin in the middle." Carver needed to hear this. She was on her horse and riding toward Red Cedar inside 20 minutes. She spent 3 hours in Carver's office going through everything she knew about the Parker County case, which was more than she had realized she knew until she started talking. Carver listened with increasing attention and increasing coffee consumption, which she had come to recognize as his indicator of engagement. And by the end of the 3rd hour, he had sent 2 telegrams, one to the Parker County clerk and one to a colleague in Helena, who knew the territorial court's procedures better than anyone in Red Cedar. "If Fitch's original survey citation is thin," Carver said, "we can challenge the filing's factual basis before it's even formally admitted. That buys time and potentially gets it dismissed without a full hearing." "How long?" Hannah said. "If the Parker County records come back clean and my Helena contact moves quickly, 5 days, maybe 4. "We need 4, Hannah said. Carver looked at her. He had, over the course of the last week, recalibrated his opinion of Hannah Brooks in several significant ways, none of which he had expressed directly because he was a lawyer and not a confessor. But the way he looked at her now was the way a professional looks at another professional level and without qualification. "I'll push for 4, he said. She rode back to the ranch. Ethan was in the yard when she returned, working on a piece of tack that didn't strictly need working on, which was what Ethan did when he was anxious and needed his hands occupied. He looked up when she came through the gate. She told him what Carver was doing. He listened. When she finished, he said, "You knew about a land case in Parker County, Texas." "I drove cattle through Parker County," she said. "I pay attention to what happens in the counties I work." He looked at her for a long moment. "Hannah." "Don't," she said. "Don't what?" "Don't look at me like that." She dismounted and handed her horse to Danny, who had appeared at the appropriate moment the way Danny always did. "I did what needed doing. It might work and it might not. Carver is good and he's motivated. Let's wait." "I wasn't going to say anything about the case," Ethan said. She looked at him. "I was going to say," he said quietly, "that I have been thinking about what you said in the study, about knowing what you know. And I think—" He stopped, started again. "I think the hardest thing is not knowing the right thing. The hardest thing is knowing the right thing and being afraid to trust it." Hannah stood very still. "Because I know what I know," he said. "I've known it since the platform. I've known it more clearly every day since then. And I'm not asking you for an answer. Hannah, I'm not. I know you'll get there in your own time and your own way, and that's right. But I needed you to know that on my side of this, there is no uncertainty." He held her gaze. "None." The yard was quiet around them. Somewhere in the barn, a horse shifted and settled. Hannah looked at him for a long moment. "Go finish your tack," she said, his mouth curved. "Yes, ma'am." "Ethan." He stopped. "I know," she said. He looked at her. And something in his face, the part he'd been managing for the last 3 weeks, just stopped managing. Just for a moment. Just long enough. Then he went back to the tack. Hannah went inside and found Pearl in the kitchen, and Pearl looked at her face and said nothing, which was the most eloquent thing Pearl Kinney had ever communicated, and Hannah sat down at the table, and Pearl put coffee in front of her without being asked. And they sat together in the kitchen of Walker Ranch while the 22nd day moved toward evening, and the horses settled in the corral, and somewhere in Helena, a territorial attorney's carefully constructed filing was about to meet the documented truth of a Parker County land record. The response from Parker County came on the 24th day. Carver's rider reached the ranch at mid-morning with a sealed envelope, and Hannah and Ethan read Carver's summary together at the kitchen table, standing up shoulder to shoulder, which they had stopped pretending not to do. The Parker County clerk's records confirmed every detail Hannah had remembered. Fitch's original survey citation in the Texas case had referenced a territorial boundary marker that had been revised 3 years prior to his filing date, which meant his entire foundational argument had been built on an outdated document. Carver's Helena contact had confirmed that the same Fitch methodology, fast-filing thin middle documentation, appeared in every territorial challenge the man had mounted. Carver had filed a factual challenge to the Helena court at 7 that morning. "He thinks we'll have a response by Friday," Ethan said. Friday was the 27th day. Ethan's birthday was the 30th. Hannah did the math. She had been doing the math continuously for days, the way you do when the margin is thin enough that every hour counts. 3 days, she said. 3 days, he confirmed. She straightened up. Then we worked the ranch for 3 days. He looked at her. That's your plan. The court will do what the court does. Carver will do what Carver does. What we can control is this ranch, and this ranch needs its north pasture. Checked after the cattle move, and the water trough in the south field has a crack that Danny's been putting off for a week. She picked up her hat. Work is the plan. All right, he said. Work is the plan. But on the evening of the 25th day, something happened that no amount of work was going to hold back, because the thing that happened had nothing to do with courts or filings or Victor Walker's hired attorneys in Helena. What happened was that Pearl Kinney slipped on the wet kitchen floor at 6 in the evening and went down hard and came up with a wrist that was bent in a direction. Wrists are not designed to bend. Hannah heard the crash from the yard and was through the kitchen door in 15 seconds. Pearl was sitting on the floor with her back against the cabinet and her jaw set in the expression of a woman who is in significant pain and is deeply annoyed about it. "Don't fuss," she said before Hannah had said anything. "I'm not fussing," Hannah said. She was already crouching beside her reading the wrist with the careful hands of a woman who had set bones in field conditions, because on a cattle drive, you don't always have the luxury of a doctor. "Is it broken?" Pearl said. "I think so. Possibly just a bad sprain. Either way, you need a doctor." "I don't need..." Pearl. Hannah looked at her directly. "Let me help you." Pearl closed her mouth. She let Hannah help her. Ethan rode for the doctor and came back with him in under an hour, which was fast enough that the doctor commented on the horse selection, and the verdict was a clean break at the wrist, which was better than it could have been, and worse than Pearl wanted. The doctor said it, splinted it, and told Pearl she was not to use that hand for 6 weeks. Pearl's response to this was not printable. After the doctor left, Hannah sat with Pearl in her room, which Pearl had never allowed before, and which was evidence Hannah understood that Pearl Kinney was more shaken than she was willing to say. Pearl sat on the edge of her bed with her splinted wrist in her lap and her face doing the careful work of not showing what it was feeling. "I'm not an invalid," Pearl said. "No one said you were. I can still cook with one hand." "You probably can," Hannah agreed. "But you're not doing it tonight." She looked at Pearl directly. "I'm going to take care of supper. And breakfast tomorrow. And you're going to sit in that chair by the window and give me instructions because your instructions are usually better than my instincts in a kitchen." Pearl looked at her. Her jaw worked slightly. "The biscuit flour is on the second shelf," she said finally. "And Ethan takes his coffee without sugar even though he'll reach for the sugar out of habit. Don't let him." "I won't," Hannah said. "And the good skillet is the heavy one, not the light one. Danny always uses the light one." "I'll use the heavy one." Pearl was quiet for a moment. Then she said in a voice that was lower and less managed than her usual register, "You're going to stay." It was not a question. Hannah looked at her hands in her lap. "Pearl, you don't have to tell me. I'm not asking you to tell me. Pearl's voice was quiet, but direct. "I'm an old woman, and I've been in this house for 30 years, and I know what a person looks like when they've found the place they're supposed to be." She paused. "You look like that. You've looked like that since about the 8th day, and I reckon you know it even if you're still making up your mind about admitting it." Hannah was quiet for a long moment. "I grew up feeling like I was too much," she said finally. "Too big, too capable, too direct, too everything. Like I was always overflowing whatever container the situation had prepared for me." She looked at her hands. "And then I came to this ranch, and the container was just—" She stopped. It was the right size. It was the first time in my life the container was the right size. Pearl looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "That's because this house was built by a man who made things big enough to last. Ethan's father was a hard man, but he built for the long term." She shifted her wrist in her lap. "Ethan builds the same way. He just needed someone worth building for." Hannah stood up. She went to the kitchen and made supper following Pearl's instructions through the wall, in a voice that was only slightly managing itself. And when she called the hands in for supper and put the food on the table and looked around at Luis and Danny and the 2 other hands and the empty chair where Pearl usually sat, something in her chest did the thing it had been doing with increasing frequency since the 8th day, that full-weighted feeling. That recognition. She called through the door to Pearl's room. "Supper's on." "How are the biscuits?" Pearl called back. Hannah looked at the biscuits. "Acceptable." "That's not a yes." "Come out and judge for yourself." There was a pause. Then the sound of Pearl getting herself up and moving. She appeared in the doorway with her splinted wrist and looked at the biscuits on the table with the professional skepticism of a woman whose biscuits had never been less than excellent. She sat down. She tried a biscuit. "Acceptable," she said. Danny started to say something. Luis stopped him with a look. Ethan, who had come in from washing up and taken his seat at the head of the table, looked at Hannah across the food and the people and the ordinary, extraordinary fact of supper at Walker Ranch, and said nothing, and meant everything. The response from the Helena court came on the morning of the 27th day. Carver's rider arrived before Hannah had finished her first cup of coffee, and this time the envelope was thicker, which was either good or very bad. And she opened it at the kitchen table with Ethan beside her, and Pearl in her chair by the window, and Luis in the doorway, because Luis always knew when to be in a doorway. Fitch's filing had been rejected. Not suspended, not delayed, not sent back for additional documentation. Rejected. The Helena court had examined Carver's factual challenge and found it sufficient to dismiss the filing on the grounds that Fitch's foundational survey reference was demonstrably inaccurate, and therefore the entire challenge lacked the evidentiary basis required for a territorial hearing. The Walker estate documents stood unchanged. The marriage clause was intact. Ethan had 3 days. Pearl said, "There's the good Lord." And she meant it, which meant it landed differently than it would have from anyone else. Luis turned around in the doorway and said something in Spanish that Hannah's Texas driving experience was sufficient to translate as a heartfelt expression of relief, with some additional commentary about Victor Walker's ancestry. Danny said, "Does this mean we won?" "We won this one," Hannah said. She looked at Ethan. "How was reading the letter a second time, with the particular focus of a man verifying that the thing he's reading says what he thinks it says." Then he set it down. He looked up. And he looked at Hannah across the kitchen table with the morning light coming through the window behind her, and everything on his face was the truth. The whole of it unmanaged and unhidden, and he said, 3 days. Not a legal statement, not an estate statement, a question. The quietest question she had ever been asked. Hannah looked at him for a long moment. She looked at Pearl in her chair. She looked at Luis in the doorway. She looked at the kitchen of Walker Ranch, which smelled like coffee and biscuits and wood smoke, and the particular combination of things that had started to smell like home sometime around the 8th day. And she had been carrying that knowledge carefully ever since, waiting until she was sure, waiting until she knew. She was sure, she knew. 3 days, she said. And that was all either of them needed. Pearl made a sound that was not quite a word. She covered it by taking a very deliberate sip of her coffee and looking out the window at the morning and her eyes for just a moment were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the light. Outside Walker Ranch went about its morning, and the horses moved in the corral, and the mountains stood where they had always stood, patient and enormous, and the clock ran down toward a birthday, and a choice that, if anyone in that kitchen was being fully honest, had already been made on the 8th day, somewhere between a heifer in a marsh and a burnt blanket in a trunk, and two people learning what it means to be seen. Victor received Carver's notification at his hotel in Billings at 11 that morning. He sat with it for a long time. Then he folded it and put it in his coat pocket and looked at the window and thought about his father, who had built a ranch that was now beyond his reach, and about a cousin he had underestimated in the specific way you underestimate someone you have known all your life, and about a woman who had arrived on a train carrying someone else's bad news and had quietly, methodically, and without a single wasted motion dismantled every strategy he had constructed. He did not send a response. He paid his hotel bill. He rode east away from Red Cedar, and the road back to wherever Victor Walker went when he had run out of moves stretched out ahead of him, ordinary and indifferent, and behind him. Walker Ranch kept its morning, and the clock kept running, and 3 days felt like the beginning of everything. 3 days. Hannah said it at the kitchen table on the morning of the 27th day, and meant it with everything she had. And then she went and worked the ranch for 2 more days, because that was who she was, and because Walker Ranch did not stop needing work, simply because its future had been decided, and because she had learned a long time ago that the best way to honor a decision was to keep being the person who made it. She fixed the crack in the Southfield water trough that Danny had been avoiding. She rode the north pasture perimeter with Louis and confirmed the cattle had settled well after the move. She sat with the ledgers one final time and brought them completely current. Every entry reconciled, every account balanced, and she left a detailed notation system at the front of the ledger book that anyone could follow, including Ethan, when she wasn't at the desk beside him. Then she put her pen down and looked at what she'd written and understood quietly and completely that she was not writing instructions for someone else. She was writing for herself. For the version of herself that would be sitting at this desk in 6 months and a year and 10 years, still keeping the books of Walker Ranch, still fixing what needed fixing, still waking up in the morning with those mountains outside the window, and that man at the breakfast table, and Pearl's cast iron going on the stove at 5. She closed the ledger. She sat in the study for a moment, in the particular quiet of a room that holds the shape of a life. Then she went to find Ethan. He was at the cottonwood tree, the big one, at the eastern edge of the main yard, the one that had been there longer than the ranch house longer, probably than the Walker family's presence in Montana, its roots sunk so deep into the land that it had survived every flood and fire and hard winter this country could produce, and was still standing enormous and unhurried, casting the kind of shade that takes decades to build. Howe was not doing anything in particular. He was standing at the base of it with one hand against the bark, looking at nothing specific in the way of a man who is thinking with his whole body, and not just his head. Hannah walked across the yard and stopped beside him. She didn't say anything immediately. Neither did he. "This is where my father used to come," Ethan said finally, when something was bothering him. He said the tree was old enough to have perspective. "Does it help?" Hannah said. "It helps that something has been here long enough not to be worried," he said. "It provides a kind of context." Hannah looked at the tree for a moment. "My father used to go to the river," she said. "He said moving water was the only thing that thought as fast as a problem." Ethan looked at her. "Did it help?" he said. "It helped that the river didn't care about the problem," she said. "Same principle." She paused. "Different landscape." Howe was quiet for a moment. "Hannah," he said. "I know," she said. "I haven't asked you yet." "I know. I'd like to." She turned and looked at him, and he was looking at her, the way he had looked at her since the platform, directly, steadily, without managing any part of it. His hat was in his hand. She had noticed he did, that took his hat off in moments that mattered to him, and she had filed that detail away early and kept it carefully. The same way she had kept 100 other details of this man over the last 25 days. All of them adding up to the picture she had been drawing since the 8th day, and had finally on the morning of the 27th stopped pretending she wasn't drawing. "Then ask me," she said. He looked at her for one more moment. Then he said, I know you didn't come here to stay. I know Great Falls is waiting, and May Sutherland's offer, and everything north of this county that you were heading toward. I know you are the kind of woman who builds things from nothing and could do it anywhere. I know you don't need this ranch, and you don't need me, and you have never needed anybody to hand you a thing in your entire life." He paused. "I am asking you to stay anyway. Not because of the estate, not because of the birthday, not because of any deadline my father put on paper." He held her gaze. "I'm asking you because this ranch is right-sized for you, and I think I might be too, and because I kept half a burnt blanket for 8 years, because some part of me knew that when I found the person who stitched it, I was going to have to be brave enough to say so." The cottonwood moved above them, just slightly. The wind that comes off Montana mountains in summer, warm and slow, with the smell of grass in it. Hannah looked at him. "Yes," she said, "just that. No conditions, no qualifications, no footnotes." She had spent enough of her life calculating the margins of things. This was not a marginal thing. This was the whole of it. Ethan exhaled. It was not a dramatic exhale. It was the exhale of a man who has been holding something for 25 days for 8 years maybe, and has just been told he can put it down. It was quiet and real, and it was the most genuine thing she had heard from him yet, and she had heard a great deal of genuine things. He took her hand. He did it the same way he had done it on the platform, steadily, openly, with the respect of a man who understood the weight of the gesture. Her hand in his was not small. Her hands were working hands scarred at the knuckles from wire and weather, wide-palmed and capable, and he held them like they were exactly what he'd been looking for. She let him. "We should tell Pearl," she said. "Pearl knows," he said. "Pearl always knows." Hannah agreed. They stood under the cottonwood for another minute, just standing, his hand around hers, the mountains behind the tree line, the ranch going about its morning around them, ordinary and extraordinary simultaneously. Then Hannah said, "We still have the south fence gate to rehang. Danny keeps letting it drag, and it's going to come off the post." "It is," he agreed. So, he said. She squeezed his hand once. She let go. She put her hat back on. "Birthday's in 3 days," she said. "We should probably talk to the county reverend before then." "I'll ride in this afternoon," Ethan said. "Good." She looked at him one more time, just briefly, just the look that said everything that didn't need words. "Go fix the gate, Ethan." He smiled. "Yes, ma'am." Pearl cried. She did it privately in her room for approximately 4 minutes, and then she came out to the kitchen with completely dry eyes and began planning with the focused energy of a woman who has been waiting for a specific occasion and has strong opinions about it. She sent Danny to the dry goods store with a list. She went through her recipe box with her good hand and her splinted wrist and made decisions. She looked at Hannah once across the kitchen and said, "The east bedroom curtains need washing," which was her way of saying "you're home." Hannah washed the curtains. Luis, when Ethan told him, shook his hand for a long time without saying anything, and then clapped him once on the shoulder hard, and walked back to the barn. Danny made the mistake of cheering loudly, and Pearl told him to be useful or be elsewhere, which sent him to the dry goods store a second time for things Pearl had forgotten the first time. The county reverend was a practical man named Briggs, who had performed 17 marriages in Red Cedar County, and who received Ethan's request on the afternoon of the 28th with the unsurprised calm of someone who had heard the general outline of the Walker situation from multiple sources and was pleased to be getting the better version of how it ended. "Saturday," Ethan said. "The 30th, under the cottonwood." "Noon," Reverend Briggs said. "Noon," Ethan confirmed. Briggs wrote it in his book. "I'll be there," he said. He paused. "For what it's worth, Mr. Walker, I heard what you said in that courtroom. About the fire and the blanket and everything else." He looked at Ethan over his glasses. "That's the kind of thing a man says once in his life if he's lucky. Don't waste it." "I don't intend to," Ethan said. The night before the 30th, Hannah couldn't sleep. This was not anxiety. She had assessed that distinction carefully, lying in the east bedroom at midnight with the curtains clean and the window open and the Montana dark, pressing gently at the screen. It was not the sleeplessness of doubt. It was the sleeplessness of too much aliveness, the specific wide-awake feeling of a person whose life has shifted so significantly in such a compressed time that the nervous system hasn't caught up yet and is running all its checks simultaneously. She thought about Laredo, about her father's ranch and the Brazos River and the flat country where weather came from 50 miles out. She thought about her mother, who had stitched sunflowers on a blanket because sunflowers always turned toward what was coming. She thought about the drives about Abilene and Kansas City and the open country in between, about every place she had moved through, looking for the thing she hadn't known she was looking for because she hadn't known yet what the right size felt like. She thought about a platform and a sealed letter and a man with wildflowers who said, "I'm grateful you came all this way to tell me the truth." She thought about the 8th day, the heifer, the ledgers, Franklin the horse, who'd been named after a president, 8 years of a burnt blanket in a trunk. She got up. She went to the study and got the 2 pieces of saddle blanket from the desk where they'd been sitting, and she brought them back to her room and sat on the edge of the bed with them in her lap for a while. The burned piece and the intact one. The piece she'd left behind and the piece that had been kept. You couldn't make them whole again. The fire had done what fire does. But you could put them beside each other, the 2 halves of a thing, and understand that together they told the complete story in a way that either piece alone couldn't. She folded them together carefully. She went back to sleep. The morning of the 30th of July, 1884, came in clear. Pearl had been up since 4. Hannah could hear her from the east bedroom moving around the kitchen with her one good hand and considerable determination, and the smells that came down the hallway were the specific smells of a celebration that has been planned with love and executed with discipline. Hannah dressed with particular care. She did not own a wedding dress. This had been established and dealt with in the practical way that all things on Walker Ranch were dealt with. Pearl had dealt with it. Pearl had spent the last 2 days in the sewing room with her good hand and her splinted wrist and a bolt of cream-colored muslin she'd had Danny retrieve from the back room of the dry goods store, and what she produced was not what a city seamstress would have made, and was not what a fashion plate would have illustrated, and was exactly what Hannah Brooks needed. It was made for her actual body, not for the body that dress patterns assumed. It fit her shoulders and her arms and her solid waist without apology or concealment. It was simple, and it was well made, and it was hers. Hannah put it on. She stood in front of the small looking-glass in the east bedroom and looked at herself for a moment. She was not a woman who spent much time at looking-glasses. But she looked now seriously and without flinching the way she looked at a fence line or a ledger or any other thing she needed to assess accurately. She looked like herself, exactly like herself. She had never worn anything that let her look exactly like herself before. She put her hair up. She went out to the kitchen. Pearl turned around from the stove, looked at her and said nothing for 3 full seconds, which was the longest Pearl Kinney had ever been voluntarily silent in Hannah's experience. Then Pearl said, "Good," and turned back to the stove. Hannah sat down at the kitchen table and drank her coffee and listened to Walker Ranch wake up around her, the hands starting their morning, the horses moving, Luis giving Danny some instruction that Danny was probably not fully absorbing the ordinary sounds of a working place that was going to keep on working after the ceremony, and before it, and through it, because ranches do not take holidays for weddings, and Hannah had never respected a place more for that fact. The neighbors arrived before noon. Not just Red Cedar, the county. The people who had been in that courtroom, and the people who had heard about it, and the people who had made their own judgment about what kind of woman arrives on a train with a lariat and a sealed letter and stays because the work needs doing. Ed Hoover from the bank came. Margaret Dunfield from the dry goods. Dr. Kavanaugh, who had told the horse story at Cecilia's gathering and made Hannah laugh. Reverend Briggs arrived at 11:30 and stood under the cottonwood with his book and his practical expression and waited. Ethan came out of the house at 5 minutes to noon. He was wearing his good dark shirt, the one his mother had made, and his best hat, and he had the particular bearing of a man who has arrived at the most important moment of his life, and knows it, and is not afraid of it. He walked across the yard. He stopped under the cottonwood. He looked at the assembled neighbors and the ranch hands, and Pearl standing to the left with her splinted wrist and her completely composed expression, and Luis beside her with his hat in his hands, and Danny doing his best to look like an adult. Then he looked at the door of the house. Hannah came out. She walked across the yard, the way she did everything directly, without hesitation, without performing anything. Just herself. Exactly, herself in a cream dress that fit her and boots that had seen serious mileage, and her hair up and her chin level. She was not small. She had never been small. She walked through the gathered people, and they stepped back. Not because she pushed them, but because there was something in her movement that commanded space, the way a working river commands its banks not by force, but by the simple fact of what it is. She reached the cottonwood. She reached Ethan. He took off his hat. He looked at her, and everything on his face was exactly what it had been since the platform, clear and direct, and without management or performance. And he said quietly, just to her before Reverend Briggs could begin, "You know, everyone thought I bought the wrong bride." Hannah looked at him. "I know what they thought," she said. "Turns out," he said, "I waited my whole life for the right one." Reverend Briggs had been doing this for 17 marriages, and he knew when to let a moment be a moment. He waited exactly the right amount of time before he opened his book. The ceremony was short and plain-spoken, the way Hannah had asked for it to be, because Hannah did not believe in dressing a true thing up beyond recognition. She said what she meant. Ethan said what he meant. The cottonwood was overhead, and the mountains were behind the tree line, and the ranch hands were in their good shirts, and Pearl was not crying because Pearl had already cried and was now finished with it. When it was done, Reverend Briggs closed his book and said, "Walker Ranch, I believe you have your rancher's wife." Ed Hoover started the applause. It moved through the gathered crowd and out across the yard and up into the summer air, and the cottonwood moved above them just slightly in the particular way of a tree that has been standing long enough to have seen everything and is still capable of being moved by it. Pearl produced the food. It was extraordinary. Hannah had known Pearl's cooking for 30 days, and she had never once taken it for granted. But what Pearl laid out under the cottonwood on the afternoon of the 30th of July was something beyond daily cooking. It was Pearl making a statement about what Walker Ranch was, and what it owed to this day, and what this day meant, and everyone who ate it understood that without it being said. Luis made a toast. How was not? He said, a man for long speeches. He had worked for the Walker family for 9 years. He had watched this ranch go through hard years and harder years, and the kind of year that makes you wonder if the thing you're working for still exists. He said that Walker Ranch had always been worth working for, but that now it was worth something more than that, and he raised his glass in Hannah's direction and said in the voice of a man who means every syllable, to the woman who saw what this place was worth and stayed to prove it. Danny tried to add something, and Luis stopped him with a look. Hannah stood beside Ethan through the afternoon talking to neighbors, accepting the particular warmth of people who have revised their opinions and are glad to have done it, eating Pearl's food, watching the ranch that was now hers, in every way that mattered, go about its ordinary life around the occasion. She felt Ethan's hand at her back more than once, just briefly. Just the touch of a man who wants to know the person beside him is real, and she let it be there. And that small thing she thought was what the last 30 days had been building toward. Not the courtroom, and not the legal victory, and not the blanket, and not the fire. All of those things had led to this, the ordinary and extraordinary fact of a person who reaches for you and finds you there. Toward evening, when the neighbors had mostly gone, and the hands had drifted back to the bunkhouse and Pearl had retired to her room with her splinted wrist and the enormous satisfaction of a woman who has done everything right. Hannah and Ethan sat on the porch steps. Same steps. Same positions, him one step below her with her coffee, the Montana night coming in off the mountains, with the smell of grass and the first edge of evening cool. "Well," Ethan said. "Well," Hannah said. He looked up at her from the lower step. "Any regrets?" She considered that with the genuine seriousness she brought to every real question. "No," she said. "You, not one." She looked at the dark shapes of the mountains against the last light. "May Sutherland is going to be annoyed with me." "Probably," Ethan said. "She'll get over it." I expect she will. Hannah was quiet for a moment. I'm going to write to my father, she said. He'll want to know. She paused. He's going to want to know about the ranch first. The cattle numbers, the land, the water rights. He'll get to you eventually. Ethan almost smiled. Should I be worried? He'll respect you more for it, Hannah said. He doesn't trust men who aren't interested in the practical details. Then I'll make sure I have practical details ready. Good. She drank her coffee. Ethan. Hannah. Thank you, she said, for the wildflowers. She looked at him. Even the ones that wilted. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Thank you for the blanket. He paused. 8 years ago, when I didn't know who you were. She looked at him for a long moment. The arithmetic in her chest had resolved completely. All the calculations she had been running since the platform, since the 8th day, since the porch steps the first time, and the study, and the courtroom, and the cottonwood, all of it had come to the same number, clear and final, and exactly right. You knew, she said. You kept the blanket. I knew someone worth keeping was out there, he said. I just didn't know your name yet. The porch was quiet. The ranch was quiet. The stars above Walker Ranch came out one at a time, and then all at once the way they do in Montana in summer. And Hannah Brooks Walker, the wrong bride, the fat cowgirl, the woman. Nobody had expected the woman. Everybody had underestimated, sat on the porch of her home, with her husband, on the step below her, and the mountains behind the tree line, and 30 years of this life still ahead of her. And she was exactly who she had always been, and it was finally exactly enough. In the years that followed, Walker Ranch grew into something that the county told stories about. The cattle operation expanded under Hannah's management into the strongest in 3 counties. The books stayed current. The fences stayed sound. The horses were well handled, and the hands were well paid, and the ranch table fed anyone who showed up hungry, which was Pearl's policy, and which Hannah upheld without modification, because Pearl's policies, she had learned, were correct. People forgot eventually the version of Hannah that Victor Walker had tried to establish. They forgot the woman from the platform who didn't fit what had been expected. What they remembered instead was what she built, what she ran, who she was in the daily practical accumulated evidence of a life fully lived on land she had chosen and work she had made her own. They remembered the woman who saved the ranch. The woman who had saved the rancher's life twice, once in a wildfire, once on a platform, both times without being asked. The woman who had walked across a train station with someone else's bad news and handed it over honestly and changed the whole direction of everything by being exactly, unapologetically, completely herself. Pearl lived to be 81 and ran the Walker kitchen until she was 79, at which point she retired to the chair by the window and gave instructions from there instead, which was essentially the same job with less standing. She never once admitted that Hannah's biscuits had improved even after they clearly had. Louise stayed. Danny grew up. Walker Ranch kept working. And Hannah Walker woke up every morning of her life on that land, with the mountains outside the window and the horses in the corral, and the man beside her who had kept half a burnt blanket in a trunk, because he knew without knowing how he knew that the person who had stitched those sunflowers was someone worth finding. She had turned her face toward what was coming, just like the flowers. And what came was everything.